My name is Michel, that's French for Mike. I am a research director with the security practice at Infotech Research Group. Of course, look at the size of my forehead. Of course, I'm a security analyst. I can do nothing else with this face. My day is filled with helping clients developing security strategies, implement security incident management program, and increasingly improve their ransomware resilience. We have a great program set up for you today. The next 35 minutes of your lives are going to be taken reviewing recent ransomware attacks. I'm going to give us a bit of a ransomware primer to make sure that we're all on the same page. And then we'll look at an interesting case study, Colonial Pipeline, that happened just a few months ago. Then we're going to pivot from kind of like learning about ransomware to learning about what we can do about it. So how can we reduce our ransomware exposure? What are some of the common challenges that my clients face? And what are some of the solutions to those challenges? If there's time at the end and you feel inclined, I would love to answer your questions. If we get questions that we can't get to during the session, I'm happy to look at them afterwards as well. So we're here because ransomware is really all over the news. So ransomware attacks are constant and they're increasing. You might wonder whether attacks are increasing or whether we're simply more aware of them. I can tell you that it is the case that the number of attacks are increasing, as are the size of the payouts. If anything, cases tend to go unreported as companies attempt to reduce the reputational impact of breaches. Why are ransomware attacks increasing? There are several contributing factors. The first and most important one is the rise of ransomware as a service. Tools are available now that allow gangs with next to no coding skills to infiltrate networks. Gangs are specializing in certain parts of the workflow. So some gangs are specializing in infiltrating the network, then they will sell access to your networks to other gangs who then go on to deploy malware in your systems. There's also the rise of cryptocurrencies. Of course, payments are anonymous and nearly untraceable. So as cryptocurrencies are more available to ransomware gangs, it makes it easy for them to get a large payout anonymously. There's also the state support or the support from state actors. So countries like China, North Korea, and Russia are suspected or are known to support ransomware gangs that are operating in their territory. And then finally, the last contributing factor that I want to mention is recent success, right? So multi-million-dollar payouts are creating a strong incentive to participate in the industry. What's interesting is that all of the headlines I have here are from 2019 and early 2020. The problem has only gotten worse since then, right? So if you want to find grim stats on ransomware attacks, it's probably the easiest thing you're going to do today. The internet is inundated with reliable information on these attacks. The numbers are on the screen, right? So 50% of cybersecurity professionals believe that their organizations are not prepared to deal with ransomware. The average cost of a ransomware attack is increasing. So this is the number that's on the screen is from 2019. The next slide will have numbers that are truly staggering from early 2021 about the size of the payouts. A new organization is attacked by ransomware every 14 seconds. So I've been on the phone here for 15 minutes. That's a lot of ransomware attacks already in this conversation. And then between 2017 and 2019, ransomware attacks have increased by 97%. So the reason I don't have more recent data on the increase of ransomware attacks is that I like to look for global data sets. So if you're ever out there trying to find information, you'll find that a lot of technology, a lot of vendors are publishing their own statistics, and the numbers are based on their own data sets, right? So for folks who use FireEye, how many ransomware attacks have we seen? And so my goal is always to get global numbers, right? So I want an agglomeration of those stats. I don't want the stats for a particular platform. And so the numbers I have are from 2017 and 2019 to 2019. So this is a recent timeline of ransomware attacks. And so in the first half of 2021, there were several really high profile ransomware attacks. And they're on the screen here. You can see that these are big names, right? Large organizations are being attacked. The ransom demanded and paid out are staggering. So we're talking about millions and tens of millions of dollars in ransom. And so another thing that you'll notice on this list, right? So Colonial Pipeline, of course, is there. In the spring, the pipeline that feeds the east of the United States was locked up by ransomware, and they had to pay the ransom within days to get to get access to their systems because they faced a lot of stakeholder pressure to open up again. And it had a significant impact on the American economy at the time. There was an immediate run on gas stations. There was an immediate impact on the fuel supply. One other attack that I want to highlight is Kaseya on the top right of the screen here. And so in 2021, there was two very high profile so far attacks on what you might call like a third party attack, right? So SolarWinds was the first one and Kaseya was the second. So these are IT service management and asset management service providers that have pieces of software that reach into other organizations. Through those vendors, thousands of other organizations were infected either with malware or with ransomware. So at the last count, Kaseya had the Kaseya event had infected more than 1,500 organizations, distributing ransomware and demanding payment to unlock the different systems. And so what we're seeing a rise in attacks, and we're seeing a rise in attacks on third parties that then might infect your system. So there's a third party risk as well. So that's a great horror story just in time for Halloween. What questions do I ask when I come to work in the morning? So the first thing I ask myself when I deal with one of these cases is, why are so many organizations unprepared for an attack? So I showed you some statistics from 2019, right? Some headlines from 2019. So it's not a new problem. It is the case that it's getting worse. And so how can we help? How can we stop this? How can we prepare our organizations to do what's within our control, right? To reduce these attacks and to reduce their impact on our organizations. So I can break that down into three sets of questions for myself. So how do I prevent ransomware attacks on my organization? How do I respond to the security incident once it happens? And then how do I recover my system? Ransomware attacks are unique in the suite of security incidents in that they're both a security incident and a significant recovery incident, right? So the whole point of a ransomware attack is to disrupt business, like lock up your systems and stop the business from doing what it does. So let's start looking at the anatomy of a ransomware attack to see if we can get some traction on these questions. So what you see on your screen now is the anatomy of a ransomware attack. The bottom squares are a typical workflow for a ransomware attack from the perspective of a malicious agent. The top text are actually techniques and tactics taken from the MITRE ATT&CK framework for threat preparedness, right? So I offer that to you because that framework is especially helpful if you're looking to learn how to mitigate some of these tactics, the risks of some of these tactics that malicious agents will use. So even now, the tactics have not changed, right? So even as the problem is getting more serious, the basic tactics have not changed. So 95%, up to 95% of attacks start with a phishing email designed to avoid spam filters. Once the link is clicked, the system will launch malware undetected by using legitimate commands. Next, it'll run a net user command to identify user accounts. Once it finds a target admin accounts, it uses brute force tactics to crack it. With the admin level rights that the accounts give them, they'll move through your environment and collect data, infecting as many critical systems and backups as possible to limit recovery options. They'll start exfiltrating data undetected to gain more leverage. And finally, they'll encrypt the data in your system and in your backups, which will trigger an alert. Then they'll deliver a ransom note. So what I want you to pay attention to right now is that they are in your system, the dwell time of ransomware, on average for 95 days before they are detected, right? So the tactics that they use use a lot of legitimate commands that your system may not pick up with normal network monitoring tools. I also want you to notice how ransomware attacks are designed to apply maximal pressure, right? So if I just encrypt your data, you're going to use your backups to restore. If I encrypt your backups, then you might just have to bite the bullet and do something about it. And I can also apply pressure to your organization by exfiltrating data that you are under pressure to keep confidential, right? So we're thinking about regulatory data, intellectual property. So the whole thing is designed to really put a lot of pressure on your organization. So what are we seeing for trends and attack vectors? Well, I've already kind of hinted that the attack vectors have not changed, right? We're still using a lot of the traditional approaches to enter your system. What's changed is the profile of the targets that ransomware agents go after. So government, healthcare, and higher education organizations are particularly at risk. They're often underfunded. They're stewards of sensitive information, and they're highly regulated. Their environments can be difficult to secure, and they face a high pressure for availability. And they have the resources to pay large ransoms, right? So what we're seeing is a lot of those organizations being targeted. I also mentioned the third-party risks. So the latest high-profile attack also target MSPs and IT asset management platforms. So that's also new. So the Colonial Pipeline is a great case study to review for a ransomware attack. There's a lot of information out there on how the event evolved, and it was also very public. So let's start with detection because it tells a better story, right? So in the early hours of Friday, May 7th, the ransom demand was detected by a control room employee via a pop-up message on a control room device. Within an hour, the Colonial Pipeline had shut down its system to contain the events, which is always the first priority during a security incident. What was challenging about detecting this attack is that the ransomware gang, DarkSide, had the code itself was encrypted, which allowed it to evade detection by endpoint protection. So this and the other anti-detection techniques that I mentioned at the onset are common amongst modern ransomware attacks. So moving from detection now onto response and recovery, one day after detecting and containing the malware, Colonial paid the ransom of $4.4 million. So it's not clear whether Colonial chose to pay because it was unable to restore the systems from backup, or whether the recovery time would have been excessive, or whether the exfiltrated data prompted the payment. We do know that they faced a lot of stakeholder pressure, right, to put things back online. And so this is a great example of critical infrastructure, incurring huge losses from downtime and facing pressure to restore the availability. So if you go back now to the compromise, as we did some research, we found that the initial breach was from a compromised password, but it didn't come from a phishing event. The password was just found on the dark web. So somehow, sometime in the past, the passwords were exfiltrated, and that's how the ransomware gang got the information. So what did we learn from this? So first, we learned that phishing and identity-based attacks are still the main point of entry for ransomware attackers. Ransomware is evolving to evade detection and complicate system restoration. So they'll hide in your system, they'll encrypt your backups, they'll make it more complicated for you to restore your environment. They'll exfiltrate data to put pressure on you to pay the ransom. The difference between an organization that pays a ransom and one that doesn't often comes to whether they're prepared and able to respond and recover. Right? So do they have the incident response process to kind of to respond? And do they have the disaster recovery process and the backup strategy to put things back together quickly? So pivoting now, we've got a good idea of what ransomware is, what some of the trends are. We mentioned, how the targets were changing. We also mentioned the increase in third-party risk from cases like Kaseya. So what are we going to do about it? So the first thing to do is to make yourself less of a target. Traditional security practices aren't wasted, right? So you're not wasting your time doing those things. They are effective. If you make it harder for ransomware gangs to enter your system and move freely within your system, you're going to be less of a threat. So you want to do traditional perimeter and endpoint security. That still matters. You want to follow standard security best practices. So come up with a business-aligned, risk-based security strategy. Design and deploy and enforce security policies to mitigate those security risks. So you want to segment your network. You want to implement a least privilege access policy. And you want to put in place a security awareness training program. So no one who's listening to this video will find this shocking. It's not new. Those things still matter. So those initiatives need to be put in place, and they need to be well funded. Once you have those in place, then you can start looking at some of the new technology that will allow you to do advanced threat detection. So there's AI-based security monitoring tools that differentiate between the normal use of network commands versus what a threat actor might do when they're scouring your environment for vulnerable admin action, right? And some of those tools are behavioral tools. They can look at what accounts are doing, and they can notice that there's something strange going on with Michel's CRM account, right? So all of a sudden, Michel is going through information that Michel has never gone through before, right? So that would raise a red flag. Now, some of those tools are expensive, So it's important to make sure that you can make the case for them, right? And the best way to make the case for those things is to really build that business aligned security strategy. So you want to be able to understand what the business does and put your security strategy in those terms, right? So how, as a security professional, do I support the organization? The organization is not in the business of being secure. So how is it that we contribute, right? What kinds of risks do they face, right? So what are the security pressures? What external threats do they face? What do they expect for security, right? So are there any compliance obligations that we have to highlight? And what's their risk tolerance, right? Once I've got that information, then I can do a very detailed review of controls that will allow me to improve the security posture of the organization. So where do we stand on these security controls? Where do we want to be? Um, and what can we do to get there? Once we have an initiative list of gap control actions, we can start grouping them in a way that makes sense. We can start um, evaluating them for costs and for impact and for effort. And we can go to the business with a plan that makes sense, right? So that is still, so that basic action of building a business aligned, risk aware, holistic security strategy is still the best tool in your arsenal. Now, of course, there's a lot more that you can do. So the key at that point, once you've got your strategy, is to really look at what drives ransomware, what tactics and techniques drives ransomware gangs, and then one by one addressing the risks that those tactics and techniques pose, right? So, for example, you want to improve your defense against email phishing attacks. Email phishing attacks continue to be the most popular method for attackers to obtain information and to gain access to your systems. So you want to refocus your security awareness and training program around the dangers of ransomware and email phishing attack. Next, you want to secure your privileged credentials, your admin accounts. Once they have access to a privileged account, all bets are off, right? It's much more difficult to stop them. And so what can you do? Some of the solutions are technicals. You can implement multi-factor authentication, for example, which will increase security friction with your stakeholders. So you need to be ready to have that conversation. But you can also deploy processes that are fairly easy and innocuous, right? So a great example is the principle of least privilege. If you deploy that, it makes it more difficult for the ransomware, the malicious agent, to do their work, and that's what you do. Given the recent strings of attacks on service providers, you also want to review your third-party access. You want to limit the use of VPN and remote desktop protocols. You might also consider putting a vendor security service in place, right? So let's make sure that we understand the security postures of our vendors, even reputable vendors. And let's make sure that we keep on top of that. You can, next, you want to mature your vulnerability management program, right? So ransomware gangs exploit software vulnerabilities for the infection and distribution of malware. You want to consider your entire IT ecosystem. So don't stop just at software and hardware assets. Include other things that are in your IT footprint: network devices, IoT devices, custom applications and libraries. Finally, you want to validate your response and recovery options, right? So you want to make sure that you understand the RPOs and the RTOs that the business expects. And you want to make sure that you understand the impact of ransomware on those things. So if a ransomware attack takes data away from your system and you can't restore your system, given your backup strategy, in an acceptable time. So maybe your backup strategy, if you have infected backups, will only allow you to restore data from 4 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago or 12 weeks ago. The business needs to know that, especially if they expect an RPO of and an RTO that's much more conservative than that. A lot of times the challenge is that the organization doesn't understand those things. Like they don't understand the impact of ransomware, what would happen to the organization if they were attacked by ransomware. So having said that, what are some of the common challenges that folks face? There's 3. So in my conversations with clients, the first challenge that often comes up is that ransomware remains a low business priority despite executive attention. So things you'll hear are things like, I was watching the news last night and there's another attack, another high profile attack. And, I just felt good because I know that we're secure, right? So you're doing a great job as a security professional and we don't have to worry. Well, there's a bunch of problems there, right? So that confidence might be false confidence through no fault of the security analysts. It also paints it in kind of like an on or off mentality, right? So either we're secure or we're not. In reality, how secure we are changes over time based on the threats that we face. So we're more or less secure. It's not a fact that we are secure or we're not. Oftentimes, security or business leaders will not understand the impact of ransomware. So for example, I was working with a hospital a few weeks ago, and the CEO of the hospital finally understood that if a ransomware attack happens, to contain the events, they would have to shut down the systems that had patient records, which would impact the emergency room, right? So the emergency room would no longer be able to offer services unless they went back to paper, and they weren't prepared to do that. And so sometimes just kind of like connecting the risk to the business activity makes a big difference. Second common challenge, response planning doesn't go deep enough to test ransomware readiness. And so we may have incident management processes in place, but they're not documented. If they are documented, they don't go into the detail of different security incidents that we might face. And so that can be a problem, right? So that you don't want the first ransomware event that you respond to, to be live, right? You want to have a plan before the event. The third challenge, you've probably guessed it by now, storage, backup, and disaster recovery plans don't account for ransomware scenarios, right? So if I reach for my backups and they're encrypted to 12 weeks ago, that's going to have a significant impact, right? Then I'm going to have a lot of pressure to pay that ransom so that I can get access to that data again, right? But organizations don't always think that through. So how do we respond to each of these challenges? So very quickly, let's go through each of them and I'll give you a few ideas to work on. So the first one, ransomware remains a low business priority. I've already mentioned you can communicate the risk ransomware poses in organizational terms, right? So let's start with business impact analyses. So a lot of times we'll do business impact analyses and we'll think, okay, so what if I lose my system? What happens if I lose access to the system? How much data can I afford to lose, right? So that's a traditional kind of question that we ask during BIAs. One question we often don't ask though is what happens if I lose my data? What happens if it's exfiltrated? What happens if it goes public, right? So there might be regulatory implications, right? I might face some fines for the loss of that data. You want to use so you want to make your BIA a little bit more sensitive, right? To include that question. You want to use the resulting data impact analysis to inform specific business decisions regarding ransomware. And there's 3 key decision points on the screen. What backup and strategy solution do I need? How far back do I need to maintain daily backups? Do I need to invest in multiple immutable backups that are not open to being encrypted or changed? What about advanced threat detection tools? So those solutions aren't cheap. What's an appropriate level of investment for my organization? And then finally, how do I balance the need to minimize end user aggravation with ensuring appropriate security? Right. So if you put multi-factor authentication on everything, people are going to notice, right? So I'm a big fan of MFA, but I need to make sure that I explain to the organization why we're doing that. The second challenge we mentioned is response planning. So response planning doesn't go deep enough to test ransomware readiness. You have to roll up your sleeves and you have to build and test your ransomware response workflows and runbooks, right? So there are some very good approaches that you can use, very systematic approaches that you can use. You want to have a workflow that's high enough level, that's documented, some kind of Visio diagram, so that you can show every stakeholder that's involved in the response what their role is and how they're going to interact with different stakeholders, from the service desk to the critical incident response team, to your network and system administrators, to your CISO, right? You want to understand how you're going to interface with your different stakeholders, your customers, with law enforcement, with HR. So you should have that in a workflow that kind of outlines in a picture how this is going to go. To keep that workflow manageable, you want to take the detailed checklists out of it. You want to put that in run books that mirror the workflow. So for each stakeholder, what are the key decision points that I need to be aware of? What kinds of questions do I need to ask? What actions do I need to take? And then you want to test it. You want to test it because unlike other kinds of security incidents, you're not going to face this one every day. So you're not going to be well practiced, right? And you don't want to practice on your first ransomware event. And so I recommend that folks do tabletop planning exercises at least once a year on these black swan events, on these really high impact security incidents. The final question the final challenge that I mentioned was the storage and backup question, right? So how do we build a storage and backup strategy and disaster recovery plan that accounts for ransomware scenarios? Well, you want to apply an in-depth defense strategy. So if your backup strategy looks like what's on the screen now, you're not ready, right? So there are not enough restore points. So in this example, if local backups are infected, the next restore point is up to 7 days old, right? There's an immutable backup, I suppose. So weekly tape backups are immutable; they don't change, and they're also held offsite. But restore from tape is slow, right? So you're going to have to bear that in mind. There's not a lot of diversity in your storage media here. And so if this is your backup strategy, you're not yet ready for a ransomware attack. Now, this situation is much better, right? So there are multiple restore points here. So your most recent backup might be infected. You want to be able to roll back the system, but that you need to have options for that. In this case, you maintain off-site backups and use different storage media and backup locations. So if you can make the attackers jump through more hoops, you have a greater chance of detecting the attack before all the backups are affected. You want to invest in immutable backups. So most leading backup solutions offer options to ensure that backups can't be altered after they're written. And then finally, you want to prioritize your investments, right? So these strategies will add to your backup costs. So go back to that business impact analysis to decide which data sets require higher levels of protection and tailor your backup strategy that way. I noticed a bunch of comments and questions in the chat here, so we're just going to I'm just going to close and see how many questions we can take.
We definitely do. I'm going to try and go in order to make sure everyone's covered, Michelle, but I mean, it started off extremely insightful and very scary, and didn't get any better. So, no, but I appreciate the insight. The first was John Jeffries. He jumped out pretty early in the session and was talking about Crimeware that he was reading about earlier today, and how prevalent do you think this is going to be in our future? Is it criminals who are dealing with us or dealing with this? So, any thoughts on Crimeware?
So I'm not familiar with that term. Unfortunately, Crimeware. I'm going back to the chat here to see if there's any more context. Can we get back to it? I just need a little bit more context.
Yeah, no, I'll make sure you connect with John as that have discussion. And Jamie Pittman went on to ask about the push of the Biden administration to have an impact on the ransomware trend. What do you think of the administration's policies towards it? Do you have any take on that?
The Biden policies are a step in the right direction. So there's two things that happened policy-wise in the last few months. One was the Biden policy, the executive order. The other was the summit that happened a few days ago, where organizations or about 30 countries opted to cooperate to fight ransomware. A lot of the material in the Biden executive order is apple pie, right? So let's get the basics right. Let's make sure we lock down our environment to fight ransomware, and that is absolutely going to help. The summit that happened a few days ago is important because one of the elements of all of this is state support for ransomware actors, and individual companies aren't going to be able to do anything about that. So there's a role in all of this for states to play, right? To combat state support for ransomware.
Okay, yeah, no, interesting response. And then actually that leads on nicely to a comment that Jake Kineholz actually mentioned about the recent news about the US Treasury Department willing to punish crypto and companies that pay for ransomware attacks, and whether you think that'll change the RAS industry.
So I see that as another step in the right direction. So if we go back to the four things fighting the rise of ransomware, right? So one of them is state support for ransomware gangs, but the other one is the cryptocurrency, right? So if we find a way to make it more difficult and less transparent to use these payment tools, I think that's anything that goes in that direction is going to have a good impact.
Yeah. Okay. I got a few more here as well. One that I'm interested in as well, and Jamie asked it, but do you see using a worm drive to store backups offsite on hidden networks as a good preventative measure against ransomware and the attacks that they're seeing?
Well, let's see. So if it's offsite and separate from your network, you're more likely, it's going to make it more difficult for the malicious agent to reach it. So yes, that would help. So anything that you can do to make it more difficult for the malicious agent to do their work, the better. I'm afraid that's the only answer I have. So yes, I think, but
anything helps, right? But I mean, it's how complicated can it be? In some of the numbers, and a few people have asked for your slides, which I did, fully expect, and make sure everyone that gets a chance to get this and the recording as well. But do you have any insight into what other countries are hit other than the US, and insight into what maybe say like a Russia reports? Jake jumped in and said China is number 2 in ransomware attacks, but do you have any data that looks at external, particularly other major countries?
The big three that I see popping up over and over again are North Korea, China, and Russia. In terms of countries that attack, in terms of countries that are the recipients of attacks, the number 1 country is Israel. So in terms of the sheer number of attacks given their size. So Israel is one of the major targets, and of course the U.S. is the other one.
Okay, that's in Israel. That's interesting. Jake mentions here, we know that companies are purchasing cyber insurance and that actually sees them increasingly targeted by ransomware attacks because of their purchase. Will we see a shift in how insurance providers vet customers' baseline security in an effort to, avoid being targeted because they have security against attacks?
The cybersecurity insurance is an interesting question. So I've seen some cybersecurity insurance organizations say that it will not pay ransomware attacks. So you can use cybersecurity insurance, but you can't use it to pay ransomware because it feeds the problem, is the thinking. So some insurance policy providers, one of their riders is that they will not pay. So that's the first thing. The other thing that we're seeing as a trend for cybersecurity insurance providers is the provision of negotiators, right? So yes, you can get cybersecurity insurance, and yes, we'll pay for ransomware attacks if you're required to pay a ransom, but you have to have one of our negotiators. That's not a bad idea. So if you go back to the history of extortion, the same thing happened in the 20th century with insurance providers in the case of kidnappings, right, and extortions. The Heidenberg baby is a great example. And so the response from insurance providers back then was the same, right? So yes, we will provide insurance coverage for these horrific moments, but if you're going to be required to pay a ransom, we want you to use a professional negotiator. And the professional negotiators basically drive down the payment, right? So they know how to negotiate so the payments don't get bigger. And that removes some of the incentives for all of this.
Okay, so there's value there. Jamie mentions here that you talked about the threat sitting in the network for 90 days or more. Is that typical from past incidents that were discovered?
So that I've got the source of my presentation. That's data from actual incidents, and 95 days was the average. So I know the SolarWinds attack wasn't a ransomware attack; it was a malware attack. It was spyware. But the SolarWinds attack, like the dwell time was something like 180 days, if not more. So 95 days is the average.
Okay. So obviously there's a few people requiring a list of tools that are on the date. Just moving forward, Felicia would like to ask about, you recommended doing ransomware testing once a year along with separate tests for other events. So I guess that may have been prior to you mentioning that once a year seems about the amount of time at a minimum, just to repeat that, right?
Well, so here I have in mind tabletop testing exercises for your incident response and your disaster recovery. I start with once a year because that seems reasonable, but I would do it more than once a year, right? If I can convince you to do it, semi-annually or quarterly, then I would recommend that. So your DR plan needs to be tested. Your ransomware recovery needs to be tested, but then you have other high criticality, high impact security incidents that also need to be tested. And so I would come up with a schedule, right? So whether we do these tabletop planning exercises quarterly, semi-annually, or annually, I would come up with a schedule and make sure that we cover the big ones periodically, that we have a plan. So that's where I would start.
Yeah, and actually a nice follow on, which is probably the last question. Is there a simulation tool that you're aware of out there for small to medium businesses or even large enterprises that can safely test ransomware in an environment that you're aware of?
I am not aware of any tools that do that. I'm just drawing a blank right now. So if you, so I'm just drawing a blank right now.
Yeah, $1 million idea there, Jake. Could be a good one. I think that's about it for the questions that have come through. I mean, I had some feeder questions, but we're well into the almost 15-minute mark. Look, naturally, we want to get your content and make sure it's available to everyone. And Jake mentioned here, maybe for everybody who heard that question, Infection Monkey might be a solution that can actually address testing ransomware for businesses internally within an environment. Michel, is there any sort of wrapping points you want to make? If not, I'll close us off and make sure people have the afternoon.
So only two things, right? So start by getting the basics right to make yourself less of a target. The basics still work. Next, you want to build a layered defense system so that you reduce your exposure based on the tactics and techniques that malicious agents use for ransomware.
Well, great insight. We appreciate your time today, Michel.